So this is my reading and commentary, reflections on chapter 27 of the Proverbs. This marks episode 1. Boast not yourself of tomorrow, for you know not what a day may bring forth. So I want to describe a particular experience, an individual experience. And there's something in here that I think relates directly to this. There are a number of different situations that I can imagine. There are the more common, and then perhaps the more atypical, which is something that is occurring this week. It happens to be the week of a holiday. And given that it is, the holiday finds itself on one of the days of the week, we have that day off for work. And because of it, I found myself thinking, not to an extreme degree, though I have been guilty on certain occasions of thinking in an extreme manner of that would broach this boastful territory, meaning that when I am thinking about a day off or a situation in which work is not part of the schedule, there can be associated with it, as is in the case of this week, a sense of satisfaction, that there is a sense that I'm looking forward to something. That in and of itself may not necessarily be a bad thing. I think looking forward to things, paying attention to something such that one understands the merits of a particular experience that is different from the norm. But all the same, there is something that is sacrificed, I think, that ought not to be, if one considers things carefully. And in the situation where I find myself thinking that I just want a day off, that what I am doing today, I am just doing passively, in a sense, in order for me to get to that day off, that I can have this release or the satisfaction that I know is possible on that day. And I've convinced myself that this point in time, that the place that I'm at now is not going to be the thing that fulfills me. It is not going to be the thing that I can find enjoyment out of life. And there is a certain sense of selfishness which is inherent in the term boastfulness. To boast means to talk with excessive pride and self-satisfaction about one's achievements, possessions, or abilities. One must ask the question, well, why is it that at the particular moment in time when I suggest to myself that I don't want to be in that place, I don't want to be doing what I'm doing, why is it that it is this way? And moreover, perhaps more importantly, why is this the thing that leads me to believe that the future, the tomorrow, is going to be the thing that actually brings me satisfaction? What do I hold internally that gives me such certainty? Now, there may be reasons. There are many reasons for why a particular situation or a particular place may not be the most enjoyable thing, the most enjoyable experience. But there's something farther than just this reasoning about tallying things, tallying the pros and cons. There's a layer that is deeper. I can feel it. And by reason, I think it is because there is an admission on the part of the self that it does not have the authority to make. It claims a certain degree of certainty a certain degree of certainty for which it surrenders potential. It surrenders an aspect of experience that would otherwise be within the willful capacity to control, direct, to satisfy. So if we take, for example, the situation that I had described about work, the fact that this week is a holiday week, so there is a day off in the middle of the week. Also, we can extend this out in a broader sense. Sometimes I hear this from coworkers, sometimes I hear this from myself internally, that Monday is such a difficult day. It is a day that is terrible. I can't wait until Friday. That day is now adjacent to the weekend. So whatever I do now, whatever effort I put in now, I know that in a few hours' time, I will be able to relax, and I'll have an entire day, or at least some hours of that day, where I can maybe get some extra sleep. I can recharge the batteries. So perhaps I'm justified in expending additional energy, putting forth a greater amount of effort, showing greater strength that I would otherwise not show, because I know that what is coming forward, what is in front of me, is just more work, more of that drudgery. And as I've mentioned, I think within reason, there are plenty of situations, there are plenty of life circumstances in which unfortunate events, unfortunate responsibilities. That term is kind of difficult to say, because, well, what describes an unfortunate responsibility? But there are these situations in which a person can truly find themselves in a bad place, a bad place for their soul, a bad place for their mind. But the only way to get out of that sort of situation would be to accept where they are, and accept that in order to change, they're going to have to take every day as something special, every opportunity as something special, something unique, a new potential for which they can grow an entirely new experience or way of life, whatever the desire there is. And although I don't mean to suggest that the self has no role in this, of course the self does, but it's a matter of proportion, it's a matter of balance, it's a matter of the way the self relates to that which it can reasonably circumscribe to its own authority. And certainty is a dangerous game. Now, if I ignore for a moment all of the potential possibilities and just think about my situation at work, I know that every day there is something that I can do to give myself a sense of fulfillment despite fatigue. It may be difficult, it may be exceedingly difficult, it may not happen even if I desire it and put forth my best effort. I can fail. In fact, today I failed a few times, I know. But failure, that is not an excuse for not accepting a responsibility. Failure is a part of the process of accepting responsibility. Truly accepting responsibility is a blessing, because it leads to that sense of fulfillment, that the goal is actually achieved. The step has been taken. Now, the person, the mind, is in a place, in a domain that is better or more fulfilled than the place prior. I think there's more that can be said here. So of this picture of selfishness, of this picture of the boastful, for which I know that I am guilty, again, because I had these thoughts this week, because today happens to be Monday, and I was thinking that on Thursday it's Thanksgiving, and we get out early on Wednesday, and how much joy I'm going to feel because I don't have to be in this place. And that's such a terrible thought, because it sets up the entire day, or the next sequence of events, with this dismissive and egotistical, selfish view. And that contributes to, it may not in totality derail the situation, but it contributes to the closing of the door to a productive environment, or a potentially productive environment. I think about certainty in general. I think about what I know, or what I feel like I understand. And at times, again, given fatigue, I think it's more likely to happen under a fatigue situation. It can happen because of selfishness, that because I believe this to be true, then I know it in a way that is absolute, and there are no aspects about things of knowing, at least in this particular case, that can come to disrupt my understanding of this thing because I feel that I know it so well. That in and of itself can be blinding. That in and of itself can be destructive to growth. That in and of itself is contrary to creation. So putting that aside and returning to this environment that I had mentioned, this potentially productive environment that is not burdened by the thought of being somewhere other than in this experience. I think structurally speaking, what affords a productive environment is that orientation of attention, the strong, fluid, unbroken attention to something, and willful investment, that there is a genuine interest in what is being done, what is being said, what is being participated in. Imagine a situation in which two people are conversing. They are engaged in this conversation. It is a conversation that is actually going somewhere. There's a point to it. It's not superficial, that there is some end that is desired. And then all of a sudden somebody butts into that conversation with an entirely different conversation. And they are taking it farther and farther away from the initial conversation between the two people. Undoubtedly, there's going to be an effect. I think the effect size can vary depending on the nature of the disruption. But the point being that there is an effect size. And if and when, when the person resumes the original conversation with the person, there will be extra time, a reorientation of attention, and perhaps the disruption of what had taken place, and a subsequent destruction of that conversation. Now, there are plenty of situations in which an additional input from outside contributes to some conversation. But of course, what we are talking about here is the distraction. It is not the paralleled integration of new information. It is the contrary introduction of information that leads to this tension in the mind, the tension that is inevitably resulting in inattentiveness. Now, the last thing that I would want to mention about the first part of this verse, and I'm not sure how much we'll spend on the second part, boast not yourself of tomorrow. I think about the nature of being here. For if a person is to boast of themselves tomorrow, or to be boastful of tomorrow, there's a certain orientation that the self, that the individual, the being has to the environment and how they perceive their inner workings to be. Now, I find myself an unfortunately highly selfish person, and I've been trying to correct this for years. And I think I've succeeded in certain areas, and I've failed in others, but I understand, especially as a more of an introverted person, how deeply the perception of the inner self can provide one with satisfaction. And how just orienting the attention there and not wishing to participate in the external world, how much energy that I can get from it. But that sort of insular experience doesn't afford a productive lifestyle. It doesn't afford strong relationships. And I should take back, it doesn't afford a productive lifestyle. I think there are plenty of things that a highly individual approach to a problem may lead to a high degree of success. But there has to be at some point an integration with the rest, with the whole. Otherwise that identity won't survive. It would be like an agent that is trying to survive, a human being that's trying to survive on oxygen, that deprives themselves of oxygen because they don't want to, whatever the case might be, pollute their own stores of oxygen, whatever the ridiculous case might be. But this being and the orientation, it goes back to what I had said about this misplaced authority. That the principal identity, the very tip of the spear that can be thought of as the agent that is in charge, the agent that is made up of plenty of different cells and aspects of themselves. The tip of the spear is the driving agent, the result of that conglomeration. If this being feels of themselves that they and their heart's desire take precedence over every situation, that it is nothing but the purpose to satisfy their desire, and not to be open that circumstances that they are unaware of, or perhaps even aspects of situations and circumstances that they are quite familiar with, that they had never thought of or never participated in, then it will be missed. Now, this is in conjunction with a much broader field for which that conservative element that would otherwise restrict one's participation in things that are likely not to lead to good outcomes is a part of that story. And I don't mean to imply that the self ought to be this thing, ought to be this way of being an agent that is completely liberated from all constraints. Of course, there are going to be aspects of the self that deny particular experiences to preserve itself. There are aspects of the self that will lean on desires, feelings that are productive, and that the focus on such things do not necessarily lead to the marker of selfish. I think here about Genesis and the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. And I think about the experience of Adam and Eve of falling away from that which is good, of having this knowledge of the way that they the way that they perceive things to be. And because of such confusion and such disorientation, given the sure vastness of all of this information, that it causes them to be and fall away from something that was quite simple to them before they had started to think in a particular way. That the way in which we describe pride in the negative sense, that of it being excessive, the excessiveness implies that there is a possibility for which one's internal satisfaction can be counterproductive to their connection to God, connection to that which is good, connection to that which is true, all interrelated concepts there. The exact marker of what is excessive, I think, is a blurry line. It is something that is experienced. It's not something that I can give a definite definition to. But there are anecdotes, many anecdotes, for which I can draw on and I can remember. Of thinking that this an aspect of my experience, my orientation to a certain problem set, that because I've been thinking about my own pacification, that what begins to suffer is everything around me, because I'm not providing, I'm not sacrificing, I'm not accepting responsibility. And I think in particular of when there are many things that are built up that I have to carry at once. And the fatigue and the stress tempts the heart to say, we need a release. We can find ourselves quickly opening that release valve in anger. You can snap at this person. You can yell. You can be short. You can be dismissive. All of these sorts of things that relieve pressure. At least it feels like it relieves pressure in the short term, but it doesn't actually do any good. And this is deception. This is deceptive. Because that which is good is true. And if we fail to recognize that which is good because of the temptations of the heart, then we've given to this boastful approach, this excessively prideful approach. Boast not yourself of tomorrow, for you know not what a day may bring forth. You don't know everything. You don't know all of the particular ways in which you can orient yourself to a problem or a set of information such that what the heart desires will be satisfied. And in fact, as I've been exploring the Proverbs and as I've been integrating this wisdom into my life, I found that orientation is a big thing. And we can do our best, we can do quite well to orient ourselves to things that are quite displeasing and find something about it that, even if it's simple, can be sustaining, can be seen as good. And the problem that I have, and the problem that I think, in the broad sense, that the contemporary world faces, is the ease of opening the valve to the heart, to give this idea of release, but in fact it is a poison. What is being released is a poison. And when I mean what is being released, I mean a discharge of attention. And what's poisonous about it is where the attention goes. It goes usually towards meaninglessness. It goes to the phone. It goes to this pit of nothingness. Of course, there's something there, and sometimes perhaps it's productive, but for the most part, I think what we experience is a fracture of attention. And it's like somebody would try to build a building and yet only bring fractured material to the building site. And what results is this disjointed building that doesn't really make any sense. It is hardly a structure that anybody can live in. It probably would serve well as a modern art piece, but that's about it. So, to recap, what I see here is a warning against the certainty of what you know, and by that certainty, the deceit that can be offered to such a selfish conception by the desires of the heart, that it takes by its desire a certain sense of superiority, that it doesn't need to be responsible for taking into account the ways in which it can be satisfied through other means, or by means that are more intricate or that require more attention. And it is much more willing to sacrifice the acceptance of responsibility and the closer communion with God because of such a light and superficial release. Let another man praise you, and not your own mouth, a stranger, and not your own lips. So let's talk about this word praise. It's deeply rooted in a sense of value or appraising something. Finding the worth of something, I think, is no simple matter. Now, the true worth of something. Now, to praise God, for example, is to glorify, it is to honor. It is to do these things because we recognize something about that which we are tending to. And that image of God that we have in our minds, we come to understand somehow that this is valuable, that it's worth attention, it's worth the honoring, it's worth the glorification or the praise. Now, this is a difficult place to start from because this is a fundamental ordering principle, the idea of God. It's existential, it is ontological. A simpler, perhaps more introductory, but still complex example, or doorway into what I would like to convey when I think about the word praise, is the value of money. And the question being exactly where the value of money comes from. I think it can be said that if I am the only person that exists, let's say, I can lay before me a bar of gold, a diamond, or perhaps a printed note, a fiat currency. All of them probably have very little value to me in terms of what I need for survival. There is some value in the objects. Perhaps I can use them for certain things. The diamond is quite hard. I can make it into something, use it for something. Gold, perhaps for ornamental purposes. And in my case, in my lonely experience as the only human being, I probably would not be able to understand the richer purposes for that metal. But the point here is that of these three things, they lose their value if they lose their tethering, if they lose the context for which the value was endowed to them. And so what does this mean exactly? Well, sticking with the tethering analogy, maybe sticking to or perceiving a spiderweb type analogy, that each point has these interrelated factors. In fact, the point itself comes to be because of the lines of communication between them. And thinking about money in the modern context, it's difficult, and nor do I understand economics at that level. But I will say that of anything that is valuable, that of anything that can be seen as a medium through which value flows, which money is, I think about a road. The road in and of itself, disconnected from other roads or other places, is not really all that valuable. I'm not sure I would take my car on such a road. It would not serve the purpose of moving me from point A to point B. Now, if a road was connected between point A and point B, then it would provide me with some value, some utility, and I would use it. If a series of roads were integrated such that it afforded me not only point A but point B, but also point C and point D, and the interrelatedness between all of these points, then my range of operation, my scope of movement would increase. Something inherently valuable because I can now more effectively execute my purposes. Now, in a like manner, when I think about money, and I think about the factors that contribute to its value, much like infrastructure, I think there are multiple dimensions that we can imagine and analyze, perhaps more than infrastructure. But the basic point that I'm trying to raise here is that something of value is necessarily connected to other things, that there's a contextual relationship that affords that which we find valuable, or what draws our attention. Let another man praise you. I think it would be worthwhile to think about a few different examples of what that might look like. If I were to take it from a personal perspective, and I were to praise somebody else, much like identifying the aspects of the road that are valuable, I wouldn't necessarily completely attribute its value to my own utility of it, my own use of it. But there would be certainly an aspect for which I find another person's character, qualities, behaviors, all of this sort of thing, as a part of what I am praising, the thing that I am uncovering that is the true value of the thing. Where in the case of infrastructure, it is this point A, point B relationship and the scale of complexity that would arise from different points and more roads and so forth. Just like in terms of money, what we see is the aspects of a particular currency that affords its value are wound up in trust, state backing, physical ties, economic relationships, interest rates in our case. And although we can find ourselves in a place where we identify a currency that has very little value, we could take a country with hyperinflated currency, for which that currency really doesn't buy very many goods. It's not worth very much. You can imagine a situation in which infrastructure is eroded to the point where it is not traversable. It cannot be navigated by a vehicle. These situations erode the value or the worth of such things. And the question becomes, well, why is it so important for another person to identify that which is valuable, or to bestow this praise, honor, and glory upon somebody? What dangers does it pose the self to praise oneself? It is certainly within the bounds of ability for a person to identify qualities that they may deem in other persons to be valuable for particular reasons. And of course, a person that is worthy of praise must understand to some level that which they commit themselves to is actually good. It is correct. So I apologize, but today is a new day. It's the day before Thanksgiving. And I wonder sometimes how I should resume one of these episodes after I've given the day to stop and to reflect, but also to go about my normal business. Sometimes I find it difficult. Anything that requires a certain degree of attention, I think, ought to be difficult, so it's not a surprise that it is. It's a good challenge. A good challenge to find a way for my mind to ease into that domain of prayer, essentially. Self-reflection. Of course, these Proverbs are a little bit more than just self-reflection, but in a sense, a large prayer. A prayer of exploration. And much like in the traditional sense of prayer, I think one of the important parts about this experience of any Bible study ought to enter into it with a certain mind, a certain wanting to know, and to discover something that is certain in the sense that it is reasonable and it can be applied, it can be understandable, discernible. And sometimes in my darker moments, even if I'm quite awake, if I'm at work, I find myself fixated by what I'm doing, and my mind is drifting to and fro, not connected as it ought to be to that place of mind that is beyond the trivial. But when I engage in an experience like this, one of the central purposes of which is to reground me, to inflate the soul, not in the bad sense, not in the sense of vanity, but to inflate it in the sense that medium of communication between myself and that which truly matters is opened. It facilitates greater flow. And often, when I find myself, I keep wanting to say work, and perhaps there is something here that we need to focus on. That work is something that encompasses a lot of time. In my case, it is more than just the standard 8-hour day. It is more than just the 40-hour work week. It encompasses a lot of time. Certainly not as expensive as many in the sense of time, but still a fair amount, such that my leisure needs to be committed to something that is meaningful, significant. Otherwise, I would not grow or progress as a human being. And often, more and more lately, which I feel is a blessing, that I'm able to perceive that this is the situation. That in my working hours, what I would like to see is something different. Something changed about the way that I interact with the environment. The way that I sharpen my attention and direct it. And there's a way of thinking and approaching the Proverbs, and I think of life, in a way that is, it involves temperance, patience, attention, surely, a desire for good, and the completion of something to good reason. And to do that, there must be this environment that is created by the mind. It must create something for itself so that it can stand on something. And when I say that it must create something for itself, the willful part of the agent must recognize that it is not a closed system. That for it to be afforded knowledge, good relationships, it must be open and it must be willing to sacrifice. It must understand the context for which its goals and its behaviors are placed in. And although I find myself frequently, and sometimes I wonder if it's too much, looking up definitions of simple words, it is because, not that I don't really know what the word means, but because I feel that I don't know it enough. And every time I find something trivial, perhaps it's my lack of education from when I was younger, or my lack of attention when I was younger in school, but I find myself now fascinated by words, and making sure that the words that I use, or the words that I read, I know what they mean. And I also find it interesting that within these words, there is room for exploration. There is room for modification. For if we want to convey something, it's up to us to add the appropriate information. Now, there certain words may not be within our vocabulary, but of those words that we encounter and understand, I think it behooves us to explore it and to integrate these words and the information into something that, especially in this type of situation, will benefit in the long run. So with that, I come back to this word praise. And I don't just come back to that in and of itself. Because we take anything, any identity, whether living or non-living, and consider it by itself. But by itself it's much reduced relative to the environment that it participates in. And so praise, within this environment, we are imagining an attention-filled environment. Because, as I've established already, the word praise implies a strong component of attention, of directed attention. But it also, I think, implies a place, a position. That to praise something is not just attention. It is not just one person placing their primary focus on something else. I can look at my water bottle and say that I'm not praising it. There's much more than that. Perhaps there are feelings along with this, that I'm feeling something. I think the feelings offer us this pedestal that elevates our attentive capacity. That if I value something and I'm looking at it, if I highly value it, we are approaching something that is praised. So now we have a direction of attention, but also a degree which is fueled by our heart. As the degree is turned up, I think we approach closer and closer praise. But I have to ask the question, is it the case that within this elevator, we are only to find praise? Do we have to only go in this elevator and meet a certain threshold of intensity of feeling that we find ourselves at the word praise? And I would say that we have to go a little bit farther than just this. That once we reach that threshold, then begins something else, or in tandem with the experience that we are already on, that is, of paying attention, strong attention to one thing, and then having the feelings flood in and raise the type of attention. And by that I mean that there are many different types of feelings out there. When I just began this day anew, I had a certain feeling that I was slowly entering into. It is a solemn feeling. It is a grounded feeling. I feel connected. I feel serious. I feel welcomed by the world, and I feel welcoming to it. And there's a certain intensity of feeling that is afforded this experience. And I'm paying attention to this Bible. I'm paying attention to this microphone as though it is another person. You know, we have this quality to us. In my mind, I think, as I interact with myself, I imagine a person, sort of like a video in my mind, a person that is approaching like a courthouse type structure. And what my appeal is, I don't quite know at the moment. Perhaps it's to understand what the word praise is. But nonetheless, I have within my possession this focused attention that I must speak to some judge for some reason. And I also have this feeling, the solemn feeling, that I'm open but willing to give, that I must come to understand that feeling, and that desire to know. And of particular direction, of course, my attention is on praise. And so I walk into this courthouse. I walked up to the judge, who was conveniently waiting there for me. And I ask him, I've brought you these components, and I'm trying to define what the word praise is. And I hear among the crowd that what is required to understand what the word praise means is to understand the word approval. Or rather, I should have approval. Under your command, let's say. Under your authority or position. And the judge looks at me and he says a few curious things. He looks at me and he says, as if he knows the answer to my question, as if he can see that there were many times in my recent past that I had stumbled upon the meaning of the word, or the meaning that we have stored in this word, and yet I failed to recognize the meaning at different levels, at different scales. And so he tells me this information. And that makes me a little bit curious, and I wonder, well, why have I not noticed it? I'm here for a ruling. I wish to know what this means so I can adhere to it. And he says to me, the act of approving something is no simple matter. For what can I say about what I do when I say that something is right or something is wrong? In either situation, whether it be a consideration of rightness or a consideration of wrongness, I am approving of the opinion. That opinion can be of the jury or whomever. It could be my opinion. And yet I don't know if this approval is truly right or truly wrong. The best I can do is base it off of things that demonstrate a degree of sense and reliability. And so while I can't say that approval in and of itself means that the person or the thing, the object that your attention goes to, and upon which the feelings elevate that attention. My approval is necessary, but again, it does not guarantee that whatever you place up there on that pedestal is going to be truly supported, despite how you feel, or even what you know. For your feelings contribute surely to what you know. They may be deceiving, just as the jury may be deceived in their ruling or their judgment based on the evidence that was provided them. And I may make an incorrect decision. But incorrect decisions are not the sole focus here. What we are concerned with is truth, and every once in a while, hopefully more often than not, the opinion that is approved of is correct, or that which is approved upon is correct. And so to help understand this farther, I say to this judge, so I have this intensity of focus and this wellspring of information I've approached you in a way that has instilled confidence, or that appears to have the face of confidence, that your judgment will lead me to the right answer, or a good answer. So can it be said that I have praised you? And the judge sits back and he says, of what you felt earlier about my understanding of such things, what you have exposed is just my understanding. That for my part, I have formulated my definition as best I could, given the context, which we all ought to do. I used my understanding of the term, but found it quite readily in what you have brought to me. And I've mentioned a degree of this praise that can be found at different levels. And while you haven't done to me what you would do to a religious icon of a continual type of veneration, you've approached me in a way such that some praise was probably passed at some point for you to have taken it upon yourself to even consider it, but also to approach and to ask the question, because you have had trust in my judgment, that you respect my opinion, that I will come to a good answer. And so I believe that even in this situation we have found praise. Perhaps not to the degree that you were trying to find for that proverb. That proverb makes one consider the height of praise. And if it can come from, what happens if it comes from one individual versus another. But surely we have seen the result of this as it relates to our relationship. That your praise has brought me here for the assistance in solving a problem. And so the praise would meet that purpose here, to solve the problem. You have praised my figure to the point that the purpose of praise in this context, again, is to have a distinction made about the definition of a word. But in this proverb, we are prompted to such extremes as well beyond this situation, that the praising of a man involves quite a degree of surrender, perhaps. That there is so much focus and attention on this person that it could be blinding. And while I think that praise of this sort may be necessary in certain situations, to certain figures that are trusted and are well-meaning, but if this finds itself But if this praise finds itself on the side of the own agent, of the subject, then what would necessarily come about is a further separation between the subject and that which is outside of himself. It would create a type of self that is too solidified and not porous enough to be able to liberate themselves from self-deception. for which self-praise offers. And that is because in order to understand something, the environment is fundamental. What is needed is a lot of information, and organized information. This information is not going to be something that is produced by the self. It is only something that is found outside of it, in a way. But the inside-outside is a tricky conception in and of itself. I've said this before, but much like an ancient city, it could be any city, but the ancient city is easier because it has a wall around it, and it's easier to identify that that is the thing. If the city kept its gates closed all of the time, no one went in and no one went out, everyone inside the city would perish, its identity would crumble. I think the self is much in that way. Before the identity crumbled, the identity would begin to break apart. Well, before the identity dissolved, it would certainly break apart. But even before the breaking, there would be this fracturing. And in the fracturing, delusion, a sense of self-righteousness that is not born of anything in truth. Let another man praise you, and not your own mouth, a stranger, and not your own lips. Not your own words, not your own thoughts, and not your own actions. An interesting distinction, surely. Interesting in the sense that there is this separation between the action and the thought. As if one can be propelled, as I think is true, by the emotional state into praise, independent of thought. And so what we have is the warning against the tourniquet of self-praise that would lead to the devitalization of the individual, eventually the destruction of the self, given enough continual self-praise. But also, that praise is acceptable coming from a source outside, because they are seeing things that are not corrupted by the internal delusions, the potential internal delusions. Doesn't mean that the praise from somebody else is not delusional. But it is not gripped by an internal sense that one possesses, or that one is the divine spirit. That one is the center of everything, that everything revolves around it. Although the one is something, and it has a degree of importance, it is one in a thing, in a sea of things of many. In this sort of undulating experience of oneness and of many, and of oneness and of many. And I think also the last thing I'll say here is that there is potential for self-praise to be stimulated by external praise, because they can get that engine running. But absent of that engine running, the external praise is a perspective that one can reflect on. And if that approval by another is deemed acceptable, then appreciation, perhaps thanks, is warranted. A stone is heavy, and the sand weighty, but a fool's wrath is heavier than them both. So beginning with the first part of this verse, a stone is heavy, and the sand is weighty. I think what's most useful out of this description is the understanding that although we are talking about two substances, two images that it invokes, about something requiring a degree of strength to be able to lift, that in heaviness and that in weighty, we also have a singular and a plural. We have a stone, which is one thing, and we have sand, which is in aggregate quite heavy like the stone, but each individual grain obviously is not very heavy. And I think this is where our focus ought to be when we discuss the first half of this verse. Now, without getting too much into the second part, I want to try to outline why this might be significant. And here my mind goes back to Genesis. Again, I'm thankful that we had taken that detour from the latter part of chapter 26 into the first chapter of Genesis, because it affords us a lot of interesting images that may not be on the top of mind if one had not gone there and refreshed the memory. And so this topic of identity, of the singular and of the multitude, of one and of many, I think it's quite easy to get tripped up in these two concepts, broad concepts. And in my mind, I'm thinking about broad philosophical concepts. I could take, for example, what I have in front of me are 2 pennies. I can say many things about them. This is the first part of the difficulty, is where to start with such broad concepts as oneness or of multiplicity. Where do we tether things such that we can actually make sense of this and make it useful for our own experience, for our own lives, etc. But we're going to start basic here. We're going to start with these 2 coins, these 2 pennies. As I've said, there's many things that I could say about them. In the case of the singular, in terms of establishing the identity of one coin versus the other, I can say that physically there is a separation between the two. They are 2 distinct objects. One penny, made in 1956, and the other in 2006. And the irony is that the one in 2006 is quite muddied, as if it had spent a number of years on the street before somebody had picked it up. And the one that was made in 56 looks quite clean relative to the other one. But they are both the same in the general sense, in terms of what is on them. At least from the first glance, it appears that they are the same. There may be some difference between the two that I fail to notice, but they look the same for the most part. They both occupy a certain value, a standard value of 1 cent. Now, just because they both occupy the same value doesn't mean that they occupy the same identity, of course. Just because they have nearly identical characteristics does not mean that they are the same identity. I think from a perceptual standpoint, I suppose there may be a case that can be made about the importance of the singular, that when I pick these two things up, I am able to perceive that there are two different objects, that my mind just didn't combine them into one thing. It would seem strange if that was the case, but of course, our perception is such that it maintains this continuity of physical separation. Now, there are things that I can say about the identity that would encompass them both. And much like the imagery in Genesis, with the formulation of life, of the raising of the base material into something that is approaching the heavenly, of base material that is given purpose. What I'm looking at here is a material that has been raised already, but occupies and participates in yet a higher level organization, that of the economy, that of retaining value, which I find fascinating. Value that is wrought, that is defined by the relationships that these coins have to perhaps to those markets, to us, and to our trust. There are many factors that go into why this coin is 1 cent. And also, as I've said, it is one standard. Now, the question of multiplicity arises. And in my mind, it arises because we can say that we have two coins. We can say that from a value standpoint, we have 2 cents. Now, this conception of two-centedness, this idea, this is a value judgment on these two coins, or a value conclusion or observation. If I was going to, this is unlikely, but if I found something that was worth 2 cents, I could not separate these two coins, at least conceptually. Physically, of course, I could. But in the case of something that is worth 2 coins, these two things are bound together, much like the sand is bound together and has this weighty adjective, weighty quality to it. And that the unification of the independence of things creates a new unity, a new identity of sorts, a new identity that is classed above the singular identity, the singular bits of grains of sand, the singular coins that I have in my hand. Now, the concepts of oneness or of unity and of many or multiplicity has had a strong philosophical history. And I want to read a few things here and then return back to this coin and the examples of the verse. So if we consider the one, we consider unity, singularity, ultimate reality. The symbols here are the source, a singular origin or principle underlying all existence, universality, the unchanging, eternal, or fundamental truth that binds or governs the diverse elements of the world, oneness, a cohesive whole that transcends distinctions and divisions. In the Platonic view, we have the one. This is the form of the good, the highest and most unified principle. Of the monotheistic religions, the one is God, the singular, all-encompassing being. The many, this represents multiplicity, diversity, the varied phenomena of existence. Symbolically, this manifests in the particulars, the individual entities or specific things that make up the world. Change, the dynamic, fragmented, and temporal aspects of reality. Plurality, the distinctions, separations, and interactions among different elements. From Aristotle, we have the many are the individual substances that exist in the material world. In the sciences, the many are the myriad of observable phenomena that are studied and classified. And from broad philosophical perspectives, we have a few major classes of thought. We have monism, which asserts that only the one is real and diversity or the many is an illusion or some derivative. We have pluralism, which maintains that the many are fundamental and rejects the idea of any unifying principle. We have dualism, which seeks to balance the one and many as distinct but interrelated aspects of reality. And we have dialectical approaches, emphasizing the interplay between the one and the many, suggesting they define and shape each other. And this is, in some sense, a fundamental question on our journey, on our religious journey. I think, at least for my part, I've floated through the idea of all of these. Where I come down, sometimes it's hard exactly to say. Of course, from a Christian perspective, we are thinking about a God. Conceptualizing that God is always very difficult, or how to understand God in the broader context, among the multiplicity, that there is this great unifying force. But the nature, the character of that unifying force may not be as we think it to be. There always must be this almost multiplicity of thought, an openness to consider the possibility of unification in a different way. Because just as I think about the coins, or I think about the fingers on my hand, that there are 5 fingers, they are all distinct identities in a sense, but they participate in the broader unity of the hand. And yet the hand participates in the broader unity of the upper extremity. The upper extremity participates in the broader unity of the person, of the physical body, which participates in the broader unity of the mind and the body, to be the agent. The agent participates in and so forth and so on. And so there is this aspect that we can approach things dualistically, of looking at things from the a point of view of the multiple or of the point of view of the singular. But it doesn't necessarily end here. What I just finished describing was more of that dialectical approach, this nested, interwoven approach. Now, the source that I had read from, this is not meant to be taken too seriously. I think it is useful information, but I said it to give us sort of a framework to go off of. But it would seem that, upon further reflection, that many of these things are useful tools for which we can advance our thought, and that we shouldn't necessarily restrict ourselves to one thing in particular. Because after all, the Proverbs are about exploration. They are the key to open the door to the mind, not for the mind to find an excuse to barricade itself or to imprison itself. And so let's return back to these coins. I find myself coming back to this idea, a very useful idea, that if I'm going to understand something or to perceive something, whether it be one thing or of multiple things, I know that that thing, whatever it is participating in something above it. Now there's a question of laterality, of course, because the coin is not participating in every thing that is above it. I would not necessarily say that the coin is participating in the usefulness or the utility of my phone. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, my phone is paid off, and the value of these coins, it doesn't matter, because the phone is currently not being paid for or purchased. And so what is this laterality, or at least the idea of the laterality afford us? Well, it seems to suggest that there are things that participate in higher order participations, let's say. They are a unity that is a part of a multiplicity. But then that multiplicity comes back into some unity to form that higher purpose, whatever it might be. So again, for example, taking the singular coin, we identify the qualities. We say, let's say the metal is copper. We could talk some about the lettering. We could talk some about the person on the coin. We could talk some about the structure on the back of the coin. We could talk about the shape, talk about the weight, the density. Many qualities. But all of these things are necessary to form this singular unity. And again, the coin is participating in the broader cultural trust for which this thing has some value. That it is a carrier of value, of information. Albeit much less today than perhaps days past. And so thinking about the trajectory of this coin, as specific as it might be, the concept of laterality, I have to wonder if it's not just an offshoot of what we would consider to be multiplicity. Because it's not just the case that related things have a multiplicity, or a unity has multiplicity to it. It's the sense that there is multiplicity for the sake of multiplicity, and there seems to be things that are just not related to one another. And as I've said, we ought not to get ourselves caught in any particular philosophical distinction. But I think that this situation is possible. that there doesn't seem some ready relationship between the coin and the rock outside. But just because there is no direct relationship, or they're not sharing in the same participations, does not necessarily mean that they cannot do so. Of course they can. And I think by virtue of something being, it is afforded the possibility or the opportunity of participating in this layered structure. Now, the layered structure itself, I have to wonder exactly what that is. Perhaps we can say that this is will. This is the will of the One. This is the will of God. This is unity expressing itself through multiplicity back into unity, into multiplicity. And of the gradation of this participatory structure, again, think about the coin that I had mentioned, or think about my hand and that participatory structure. Think about myself or yourself as the individual and what you participate in. There seems to be, at least in the human context, a way in which the type of participation matters more or less. Now, on a grand scale, it's kind of hard to understand if there actually is the grand unified purpose. I think it is possible that from a first cause, there can be information, or we could say material, that doesn't directly participate in some grand purpose or cause, but again, by virtue of its being, by virtue of existing, that it is afforded the opportunity of doing so. And so there's this layer of will that is sort of permeating throughout the whole thing, which I find interesting because it's somewhat separate than the will that had caused it in the first place. Unless the will of the system is just to afford possibility and opportunity. But goodness, I think, has a role to play here. And I think goodness is a term that is ill-defined in my mind, and is something that I'm looking forward to exploring more. After I finish the Proverbs, I will be going into Plato for some time. But to return to this verse, a stone is heavy, and the sand weighty, but a fool's wrath is heavier than them both. So how can we now translate this into what we were discussing about the one and the many? We have to take a few steps, I think, before we get there. Chapter 26 is a chapter that I had called the chapter of the fool, because for the majority of the verses, the fool is mentioned. Now we are in chapter 27. We have had plenty of experience, not just in chapter 26, but in chapters prior, of talking about the fool, of outlining his identity in some sense. And from what I remember about that exploration, I think about, again, this singularity and multiplicity, in the sense that the fool is a concept, a singular concept. But the fool participates in every single one of us, as much as we may disdain that to be the case. I think the fool has a place within us. And there are various ways of defining him based on the light in which he presents. But generally speaking, I would say that the fool is a a character that is not so much concerned with the truth of things, the fool doesn't quite care much about things coming to participate in a unity. The fool is not a prudent person, in the sense that because the lack of care of unity, multiplicity to them is just as acceptable as participating in a unified structure or system. The fool is perfectly at ease and at home with saying something. And here I think of the rigid hierarchy of participation that man had at once observed with the monarchical institutions, and that of the institution of the king, and of that class. And I think about the court jester, the classic fool, that is allowed by the king to say these things that, if said on the part of another person, perhaps they would be put to death. Perhaps the fool would be put to death too, who knows, but the fool is still the character nonetheless, regardless of whether or not he's punished for his foolishness, or his place again in society. But at least in these cases, in this image of the king, the court jester is one that pokes fun at the absurdity of things, however uncomfortable that might be. In the modern day, this is the comedian, the stand-up comedian. Now, for one to point out the absurdity in things, to identify that which is unreasonable, of course, by some reasonable measure, I think that always has some place in society. There is a particular way in which this sort of thing can be presented. I think the comedian, the jester, and the fool, all of them participate in this way to illuminate something, but never to transfix that light onto something that is greater than that of that multiplicitous type of breaking down, uncovering, and then poking at the inconsistencies. It is a partial way of understanding, and it hardly ever comes to a full resolution, at least in my mind. Now, I will say that after getting that off of my mind, today is a new day. It happens to be a Friday, and Fridays happen to be good days in the sense that the weekend is here and I can devote some time productively. The aim every weekend is to find solid, productive hours and to use leisure productively. And Friday night happens to be one of those times that it serves the beginning of this potential experience for which I can learn and recover in the proper way. So I want to return to this topic of talking about the fool. I think that we have scratched the surface of discussing the fool. However, a full treatment on the being and the qualities of the fool I don't think are necessary here, because I've covered them in other areas. But I think it will suffice to say a couple things. The fool is somebody, I apologize for the repetition, but the fool is somebody that exists in all of us to varying degrees. I think that there is a degree of necessity that comes with this fool. But he is an unfortunate character. He fails in the sense that he is unable to allocate information in such a way that allows him to see patterns efficiently and to make effective decisions. Now, as I've mentioned, there's scales of the fool, and I think at the higher levels in which the fool is quite prudent in terms of recognizing patterns, at least understands that there are certain modes of being, ways of seeing that are important to his prognosis from the standpoint of his life. The fool ultimately fails, much like in the movie Cool Hand Luke, where the character possesses these qualities of affability, but also has qualities of his being that are tortured, that are self-destructive, that are nonsensical. And because of these things, it ultimately leads to his demise and to his failure, to the lack of his emotional stability. And there's an aspect here where the fool touches on epistemology. Certainly none of us will understand all things at any given time, nor will any particular person be completely prudent in their decision-making or wise in their decision-making. There will always be the influence of this foolish patrimony passed down to us. And it is a danger. It is a danger not to be able to see that which is right, or be able to integrate information and to act on that information in the environment so that we can be productive. Let alone taking in this information, also establishing goals for which we can effectively use that information to meet those ends of the demands of the heart and of the reason of mind. And so it is quite a lofty thing, I suppose, to be the fool. Now, the fool's wrath is an interesting extension of this. For when we speak of wrath, we already speak of something that is quite intensified, that of anger. When I think of wrath, I think of something that is of extreme anger. That along with the fool who already possesses these blinding qualities, the wrath is undoubtedly an additional blinder to his action, to his character. But a fool's wrath is heavier than them both. Just to say the entire verse again. A stone is heavy, and the sand is weighty, but a fool's wrath is heavier than them both. I wish to explore what it means when we are using this word heavy. For I went on this explanation about the stone is the singular and the sand is the multitude. But I'm not sure I entirely conceptualized how this relates to weight. Now, in the physical sense, we have to understand how a rock can be heavy or a multitude of grains of sand can be weighty. But it is not within the physical domain that we will primarily end up or finish our understanding. This is the entry point. And so of something that is heavy, I'm sitting at a table right now. If I attempted to pick this thing up, it would be quite difficult. It is a large wooden table. I probably wouldn't be able to do it by myself. But what does this mean for it to be heavy? From a perspective of the individual. and not just a mechanical cause. I would say that for something to be heavy means that it is difficult to be moved. It is quite solidified in place. That whether it be on my part or the part of the environment, on the part of nature, something that is heavy is firm in its place, not easily moved. And in the conceptual sphere, this movement, if we imagine a movement of something fundamental, going back to the physical domain, I'm in a house right now, if the foundations of this house were moved, it would affect the integrity of the structure. The structure would likely collapse because of that. And if we think about this in the mental domain, in terms of principles, if a principle is moved such that we don't understand it anymore, or its relationship to other things, other information or other principles, is reorganized, and our minds do not necessarily correct to understand the principle. Perhaps the principle itself is weak and it becomes unable to hold the weight of a new experience or thought, whatever. In a similar manner, the mind can become unstable. And if we are thinking about things as fundamental, concepts as fundamental as the singular or the multiple, and these foundations being potentially moved, shifted, then I think it will produce a profound sense of instability. And in the sense of the fool's wrath, the indication that this is heavier than the stone or of the sand indicates not necessarily of something of principle, although we can boil down the fool's character experience, I suppose, principally, and say that the principles that make up this identity are such and such, as I've mentioned or outlined. But it's not principled in the sense that this house, the structure of this house, is dependent upon its foundations. Moreover, the structure being something that is good, whereas the fool necessarily, I don't think, implies goodness. It's rather an unfortunate aspect of our experience. So I'd like to consider two things. I'd like to consider the approach that I've taken, in which the principle of unity and the principle of multiplicity, when they come into contact with the fool's wrath, or rather, when we compare the two, that the fool's wrath becomes something so odious, so dangerous, that the very conception of unity and multiplicity are a secondary thought. Much like there are many things in life that we can consider to be important, but in the face of extreme danger, a potentially life-threatening situation, there are many things that need to be sacrificed in that moment to preserve life. And I think about this similarly within our general attentive capacity. Some things need to be sacrificed in order to avoid the present danger, and I think the present danger would be the fool's wrath. Now, the second, of course, is the possibility that what is being referred to in the first part of the verse has nothing to do with unity or multiplicity, and rather, it's either a base analogy to the physical to get us into this broader environment to understand the fool's relationship to the mind, which I think would be the case in the first interpretation anyway, or there's something else that I have yet to conceive, which is always possible in the Proverbs. Again, they are a key to further understanding rather than an explicit directive, I think. So let's break this down with a couple of examples. First, I would like to conceptualize a little bit more the fool's wrath, or at least to give us a conception on the top of mind when we use an example. So as I've mentioned, the fool's wrath is this blinding thing. It blinds in the sense that of the fundamental aspects of mind, that being, at least going off of what I perceive the first part of this verse to mean, that if we find something, if we find ourselves in a position, a cognitive landscape where we are unable to identify multiplicity and unity, our ability to identify anything is going to be severely limited. Out of everything that we see, out of everything that I look in front of me, there are many things, and yet I can identify singular things. And not just of the physical things, but also of the conceptual and the interwovenness therein. I think about this house, and I think again about all the various items that are in here, of the books, of the furniture, of the kitchen appliances, of the rooms, of the purposes, structures of the various items. So the overall idea of this house as a structural entity, but also of the home as more of a purposeful and meaning-based identity. And all of the various unities and multiplicities therein, depending on the concept or the thing that we are discussing. Now, I think the fool, in and of itself, can find its place in some disruption here, in the misinterpretation or misrepresentation of some bit of or piece of information that would limit one's understanding of the purpose of things. Let alone, let's say, again, something quite physical, like a problem with plumbing or a problem with electrical wiring. Many people who own homes don't necessarily know how to fix these things. And yet they are elements of the house that participate in the broader unity of it. And I suppose it could be debated whether or not a lack of information in a particular area can be considered foolish always. I think that there is certainly an element of foolishness, at the very least, that is involved in a person that is unable to solve the problem that faces them, whether or not they choose to solicit a contractor to solve their problems for them. Now, the wrath of the fool is another level to this. And here I have to wonder what the distinction is necessarily between them. It's easy to say that the distinction is necessarily based on severity. That in the case of the fool, there is perhaps some disruption in which this relationship between unification and multiplication is disrupted, and that can find itself at multiple layers and levels. But it is not to the case where maybe the primary identity is affected. Like, for example, a certain degree of inability in the domain of the trades, like I had mentioned, would be offset by the ability of the person to understand that if they hire somebody that has expertise in this area that they lack, then they can make up and solve the problem. Perhaps there is a degree of foolishness in there, but it is not a degree of foolishness that blinds them to solving the problem. Now, when we bring in this conception of anger, and yet further, wrath, it is an interesting and rather bizarre addition to the fool, because why would the fool necessarily come to anger? Well, for my part, I can imagine in a rather infantile and adolescent fashion that if I am unable to understand something, that I can become a bit flustered. Whether or not it approaches anger, I suppose, depends on the degree of frustration that I have with solving a particular problem. But I can certainly imagine a situation in which anger would arise, given some potential problem for which my own foolishness serves as a barrier. And what angers me is that foolishness. And I'm tempted into a state of complacency or a state of malunion. The problem does not get solved. Again, there are plenty of possibilities here. I can imagine a situation in which a state of intense feeling would rouse in me a certain type of affliction that is afforded just based on the intensity of emotion, for which my attention would be quite limited. I think about being angry at a particular person or a particular thing. It's often at the expense of other thoughts, other experiences. I think one way to conceptualize the difference between this anger and wrath by that degree of intensity is that in the case of anger, there is this aspect of control, I think, that is still afforded the individual. Although they may display foolish behaviors because of that intense emotion, negative emotion, it is not until we find wrath, where we find vengeance, where we find justification, or justice, rather. And it is these, again, blinding ideas and driving forces that compel the mind to darkness and that severely limit, perhaps totally limit one's will, that would otherwise be open. It is a type of singularizing on the destructive, rather than the opening to those multiple roads for which information can flow. Again, the multiplicity, singularity idea. But wrath contributes to the end of destruction. Destruction is the end, in other words. Another thought that has occurred to me just now, earlier when I gave my description of the fool, was rather kind, I think. I want to add one more quality that's possible to the fool, of the general sense of somebody that is full of hot air and lacking in substance. The jester or entertainer could also be this person that amuses based on their own absurdity. It has really nothing to do with pointing out inconsistencies in reason. So to get back to what I was saying, I think the great danger in all of this, in the blinding of the mind, in the blinding of the mind to quite foundational principles, and given that I had said that flowing in this manner, being in this manner, can lead to the structural instability of one's mental state. I think that how that might manifest is that although we could think of unification and multiplicity as two separate entities, I think I've tried to, if not explicitly, illustrate that these two principles are part of the same structure, in the sense that in order to appreciate higher order concepts or higher order participations, one must have this intuitive layer built within them. Intuitive layer of what? Well, intuitive layer of understanding the relationship between the unities and of the multiplicities. Again, with the house example, the home example. And there's anything in the environment that one can look at and identify singularly, and also pay attention to the multiplicity of things and understand that the totality is the environment that they're looking at or experiencing. And of that, I think we can also infer that there are many things, many ways of understanding, of conceptualization that rest upon that organizational structure. And it's not as though wrath destroys the structure. Wrath seems to destroy the perception of that structure, or the altering of the participation with it. Because even a wrathful person, I would imagine, would still be able to walk and to articulate with objects. It's not as though they are completely incapacitated and the mind is completely fragmented from a physical or of mental reality. But it is approaching a state where the agent, the willful agent, no longer has the capacity to make the type of decisions that I would consider myself in this state of mind able to make. I feel rather relaxed at this point. I don't feel overly burdened by an extreme emotion, although I am experiencing emotions. None of them are extreme enough to blind me or to separate my thoughts from the meaning that I'm trying to convey. Another thought that has occurred to me is how this relates to our general disposition, if that's the right word. Because none of us, well, maybe I should speak for myself, I don't necessarily walk around thinking about multiplicity and unity explicitly. These are things that operate, I think, on largely a subconscious scale. And it's not to say that these processes don't occur, or that the mind doesn't use these useful principles in order to interact with the environment. But it is interesting to think that of that which can be made explicit, most of the processes of the mind occur in an implicit manner, and that at any given time, what the mind chooses to focus on is only a very small fraction of the possible things that can be made, that can transition from implicitness to explicit. And I think about the way in which the principles of mind, the principles of the subject, as it relates to the human being, inform our relationship to the environment, but also how our emotions, and also our reason, I suppose, affect how the underlying natural process of the mind is meant to play out. Now, that's a difficult thing to understand and conceptualize, because, well, there are many ways that this can play out. It's not as though there is one track for the mind, but there is certainly a healthy state that most commonly of all of mankind appreciates. And it is not until man finds himself in a particular state that he is deemed ill or pathological to some degree. And I can imagine a state in which I am not reflecting on the Proverbs, in which I am completely unaware of the principles that I'm discussing. And I can also imagine a situation in which I find myself angry or vengeful in that wrathful state. And I likewise am not really explicitly paying attention to the principles of unity and multiplicity. And so I bring that up, I guess, to say that the processes of mind are going to occur regardless of our awareness of them. I think awareness is a good thing in order to temper ourselves against the unfortunate circumstances in which foolish behavior accompanied with intense emotions can lead to some profound disruptions of otherwise automatic processes. These disruptions will severely distort our relationship to the environment, to other people, to reality, meaning the relationship to that which is genuine, actual, as opposed to imaginary or illusory. So I think I'm going to end this episode here. I'm going to try to keep them around 2 to 2.5 hours. And I will continue next time with verse 4 of chapter 27.